Are you absolutely certain you're not walking the same treacherous path that led one of God's most gifted champions to utter ruin? What if the very blessings in your life, the things you count as your greatest strengths, are actually blinding you to an imminent spiritual catastrophe? The ancient, yet chillingly relevant biblical narrative of Samson and Delilah from the Old Testament's book of Judges isn't just one of those dark Bible stories to be skimmed over. It's a screaming warning, a divine X-ray into the human frailty that invites temptation, seduction, and catastrophic moral failure. Many believers today, blessed with talents and opportunities, are unknowingly succumbing to the same arrogance and spiritual blindness that marked Samson's fall from grace, inching closer to a devastating downfall and the terrifying loss of God's favor. You might feel secure, but are you truly seeing the Philistines at your gate? The subtle corruption and manipulation designed to strip you of your divine power and lead you into temptation and ruin? The consequences of sin, especially the price of sin born from disobedience to sacred vows and yielding to lust and greed, are far more severe than most imagine, often culminating in a horrifying moment of when God departs. This isn't about fear-mongering. It's about an urgent spiritual reality check. What you're about to discover in the tragedy of Samson could be the one thing that pulls you back from the brink of your own spiritual destruction and humiliation. We're going to dissect the 7 critical stages of his undoing, the dark lessons that reveal how even God's strength can be nullified by unchecked pride and hidden weakness. Are you ready to confront the uncomfortable truths that could save your spiritual life? Before we dive into these life-altering revelations, if you're someone who believes in the raw, transformative power of God's Word and you're tired of superficial faith, then you've found the right place. Shockingly, a huge number of people who watch our videos and gain these spiritual insights haven't yet subscribed. If that's you, please take a second right now and hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Don't miss out on the sacred knowledge we share, knowledge that can illuminate your path and protect you from the very betrayal and suffering we're about to explore. Stay with us until the very end, because understanding Samson's complete tragedy, from his initial arrogance to his final ambiguous act of revenge, is crucial to fortifying your own faith against the spiritual warfare raging around us. The insights awaiting you are too vital to ignore. All right, my friend, let's delve into something truly heavy, a story from the Old Testament that serves as a stark warning for us all, the biblical narrative of Samson. You see, this isn't just one of those dusty, dark Bible stories. It's a living testament to what happens when incredible gifts, especially God's strength, aren't ballasted by a hefty dose of divine wisdom. We're talking about Samson's fall from grace, a tragedy that began not with a bang, but with a whisper of pride. Samson, as chronicled in the book of Judges, was no ordinary man. He was blessed with divine power, a physical prowess that was, frankly, off the charts. But here's the kicker. This immense strength, meant for a divine purpose against the Philistines, started to puff up his ego. It's a classic setup, isn't it? A man blessed beyond measure, yet a creeping arrogance begins to take root. This initial stage is so crucial to understand because it showcases a profound weakness, not of the body, but of the spirit. He started to believe his own hype, perhaps forgetting the source of that incredible might. This wasn't just a minor moral failure. It was the seed of his eventual downfall, a stark reminder of human frailty even in the face of extraordinary blessings. The consequences of sin often begin with such subtle shifts, a dangerous reliance on self over the divine guidance that was so freely offered. We must be vigilant against this kind of spiritual corruption. Now let's really unpack this arrogance of Samson. It wasn't just a fleeting thought. It became a pattern, a dangerous way of operating. He was set apart by the Nazirite vow, a set of sacred vows that included not cutting his hair, which was tied to his God's strength. But with his incredible power, he started acting recklessly, almost as if he were invincible, as if the rules didn't quite apply to him. This is a classic symptom of pride blinding someone to their own vulnerabilities. He'd taunt the Philistines, his enemies, not always out of a divine mandate, but sometimes, it seems, for his own amusement or to settle personal scores. This negligence towards his spiritual commitments, this disobedience to the subtle and not so subtle leading of God, paved the way for his temptation and ruin. Think about it. When you believe you're the sole architect of your successes, it's easy to become careless with the very things that made you strong. It's a dark lesson from the book of Judges, showing how easily divine power can be mishandled if humility is absent. This wasn't just about physical altercations. It was a spiritual warfare being waged within him, and his ego was giving the enemy a foothold. The biblical narrative is unflinching in showing this, serving as a cautionary tale about the price of sin. So, this self-confidence of Samson, which was really arrogance in disguise, led to a profound spiritual carelessness. He wasn't just neglecting the outward signs of his Nazirite vow initially, but the inner spirit of it, the devotion, the separation unto God. When you're spiritually off-kilter, your decision-making, well, it goes haywire, doesn't it? He started making choices that clearly went against divine wisdom, especially concerning his relationships, which, as we'll see, became a major source of temptation. This is where the dark side of strength really shows itself. Strength without wisdom is like a runaway train. It's a form of spiritual blindness, where you can see the physical world perfectly, but are utterly blind to the spiritual dangers around you. The Old Testament is full of such dark Bible stories that warn against this very thing. His interactions with the Philistines often stemmed more from personal vendetta than a clear directive, a dangerous path of revenge. This highlights a critical moral failure, the human frailty that can lead to a devastating downfall. The consequences of sin were mounting, even if he didn't see it yet. His story is a potent warning about what happens when biblical warnings ignored become a habit. This spiritual neglect, born from Samson's arrogance, is the linchpin of his tragedy. It's one thing to have God's strength, but quite another to maintain the spiritual condition required to wield it righteously. He was living proof that divine power demands divine alignment. His repeated disobedience wasn't just about breaking rules. It was about a deteriorating relationship with the giver of his strength. Imagine having a special gift but disrespecting the one who gave it. How long do you think you'd keep it? Or at least its full potency? The book of Judges paints a clear picture. His pride made him deaf to God's nudges and warnings. This carelessness, this spiritual apathy, is a subtle form of corruption that can creep into anyone's life if they're not anchored. It's a sobering, dark lesson from this biblical narrative. The Philistines were a constant threat, yet his biggest enemy was often his own untamed spirit, his unyielded will. This led to immense suffering, not just for him in the end, but for his people too, because his personal moral failure had national implications. The Nazirite vow was meant to be a shield, but his actions chipped away at it, leaving him vulnerable to temptation and ruin. Ultimately, Samson's story, right from this early stage of arrogance, serves as a profound cautionary tale. The Old Testament doesn't shy away from showing the flaws of its heroes, and that's what makes these dark Bible stories so potent for us. His excessive self-confidence and spiritual neglect weren't just minor character flaws. They were the cracks in his foundation that would eventually lead to his downfall and the loss of God's favor, however temporary. The consequences of sin, especially the sin of pride, are devastating. It's a chilling reminder that no amount of giftedness, not even supernatural God's strength, can compensate for a lack of humility and obedience. When we ignore the divine blueprint, when we let arrogance steer the ship, we're heading for stormy waters, just like Samson did with the Philistines, often watching and waiting. This initial weakness, this spiritual carelessness, is a critical warning about the price of sin. His journey, even before Delilah enters the scene, is already marked by human frailty and the dangerous allure of self-reliance, a path that always distances us from true divine power and opens the door to temptation. The biblical narrative implores us to learn from this tragedy. Now, as we continue our journey through the often shadowed corridors of the Old Testament, and specifically the book of Judges, we encounter a figure who is, for many, the very essence of temptation and betrayal, the infamous Delilah. It's all too easy, my friend, to simply label her as a villain in this biblical narrative, one of the more prominent figures in dark Bible stories, and move on. But if we do that, we miss the deeper, more chilling dark lessons she represents. You see, Delilah wasn't just a woman who made some bad choices. She operates in this story almost as an archetype, a personification of how seduction, fueled by potent greed, can lead to catastrophic moral failure and the utter downfall of even the mightiest, like Samson. Her interactions with Samson weren't accidental. They were a calculated series of moves in a deadly game of manipulation. The Philistines, desperate to neutralize Samson's God strength, saw in Delilah a tool, a weapon fashioned from charm and deceit. And what was her price? Those pieces of silver, a stark reminder of the price of sin and the corrupting influence of material gain. This isn't just ancient history. The spirit of Delilah, that cold, calculating corruption that prioritizes self-enrichment over loyalty or human decency, is something we must still guard against. Her story is a potent warning about the insidious nature of temptation when it finds fertile ground in human frailty. The deception of Delilah was a masterclass in persistent, cunning manipulation. She didn't just ask Samson for the secret of his divine power once. The biblical narrative in the book of Judges shows her wearing him down, a relentless assault on his resolve, exploiting his affection and, let's be honest, his glaring weakness for her. Each feigned hurt, each pout, each accusation of his lack of love was a carefully crafted move in her game of seduction and betrayal. This highlights a critical aspect of spiritual warfare. The enemy often uses emotional manipulation and exploits existing weakness to achieve a downfall. Her greed for the Philistines' silver was the engine driving her persistence. Oh, the consequences of sin are far-reaching, aren't they? It shows how the allure of wealth can utterly deaden the conscience, turning a person into an instrument of destruction. We see in Delilah a chilling focus, a dedication to her treacherous goal that is, in its own perverse way, quite formidable. This isn't to admire her, heavens no, but to recognize the power of a focused, albeit malevolent, will. This cautionary tale from the Old Testament is a stark reminder that temptation often comes packaged appealingly, making the dark Bible stories incredibly relevant even today when we consider the many forms of corruption. Think about it. Delilah's approach was strategic. She probed, she tested, she retreated, and then she pressed again, always aiming to uncover the secret to Samson's God strength. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a cold, calculated series of actions fueled by greed and the promise of reward from the Philistines. She became the embodiment of temptation tailored to Samson's specific weakness, his lust, and perhaps his pride, in believing he could control the situation, that he could dally with sin without facing its ultimate price. Her betrayal wasn't just personal, it had national implications, aiding the enemies of his people. This is a profound dark lesson about how personal moral failure can have widespread consequences. The book of Judges doesn't shy away from showing the ugly mechanics of this seduction and manipulation, making it a vital part of Samson's fall from grace. It illustrates the devastating impact when biblical warnings ignored about unholy alliances and unchecked passions become a reality. Her story is a stark example of human frailty being exploited, and the ease with which corruption can take hold when sacred vows and divine callings are devalued in pursuit of worldly gain or fleshly desires. This tragedy underscores the ever-present reality of spiritual warfare. The biblical narrative presents Delilah as relentless, her desire for the Philistines' silver overriding any semblance of loyalty or compassion for Samson. This greed is a powerful corrosive force, eating away at the foundations of morality until only self-interest remains. What a stark picture of corruption this Old Testament story paints. She is, in this sense, an agent of temptation and ruin, a figure who demonstrates how effectively seduction can be weaponized. Her repeated questioning, her emotional blackmail, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me?" Judges 16:15. These are tactics of manipulation that cut deep, designed to break down resistance and lead to disobedience on Samson's part, not just to her, but ultimately to his God and his Nazirite vow. This aspect of the dark Bible stories is so crucial. It shows the psychology of betrayal. The consequences of sin here are not just Samson's eventual capture, but the chilling portrayal of a human being so consumed by greed that they become a willing participant in another's downfall. It's a warning that resonates through the ages. Be careful who you trust, and be even more careful about the temptation to compromise for material gain, lest you contribute to destruction and suffering. So, as we reflect on Delilah, let's see her as more than just a treacherous lover in Samson's tragedy. She stands as a timeless warning, a figure in this cautionary tale from the Book of Judges, representing the potent and destructive combination of seduction, manipulation, and greed. Her success in bringing about Samson's fall from grace is a testament to the vulnerabilities inherent in human frailty when confronted with persistent and cunning temptation. The Philistines found their perfect instrument, and Delilah, for the price of sin, delivered. This biblical narrative forces us to consider the dark lessons about where our own loyalties lie and how easily the allure of worldly things can lead to profound moral failure and spiritual corruption. The Old Testament offers these dark Bible stories not to condemn, but to enlighten us about the very real spiritual warfare we face and the devastating consequences of sin if we let our guard down. Her story is a chilling prelude to the terrible cost of disobedience, a cost that Samson was about to pay dearly, moving us to consider the very nature of his passions. As we journey deeper into the biblical narrative of Samson, a central, rather uncomfortable theme emerges with glaring clarity, one that's absolutely pivotal to understanding his tragedy and the dark lessons embedded in these dark Bible stories from the Old Testament. We're talking about the devastating power of lust and uncontrolled passions. My friend, this isn't just about a simple attraction. It's about a profound weakness in Samson, a recurring pattern that the Philistines, his sworn enemies, and later Delilah would exploit with ruthless efficiency. His attraction to foreign women, particularly Philistine women, wasn't a footnote in his story. It was a glaring vulnerability, a chink in his armor that time and again led him into temptation and peril. This element of Samson's fall from grace, as chronicled in the Book of Judges, underscores a timeless warning. When carnal passions are allowed to run rampant, they inevitably lead to a collision with divine purpose and sacred vows. It's a somber picture, really, of how easily one can slip into a kind of bondage, an enslavement to sin, where judgment becomes clouded and spiritual blindness takes hold. The consequences of sin, especially when it stems from unchecked lust, are almost always severe, leading to moral failure and a painful downfall. You see, Samson's weakness for these women wasn't just a private matter. It repeatedly compromised his calling and his Nazirite vow. It was a consistent moral failure that made him predictable to his enemies. Think of the seduction he faced. It wasn't random. It was targeted, playing directly into this well-known human frailty. His desire for the woman from Timnah, and later his entanglement with Delilah, these weren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger, destructive pattern of disobedience. He was a man gifted with God's strength, yet he was consistently tripped up by this inability to govern his own desires, a stark illustration of the dark side of strength when not paired with inner fortitude. The price of sin in this regard was incredibly high, not just for him personally, but for the divine mandate he carried. This Old Testament account serves as a potent cautionary tale about the corruption that lust can breed, making one vulnerable to manipulation and ultimately leading to temptation and ruin. The biblical narrative doesn't sugarcoat this. It lays bare the raw, destructive nature of passions that are not submitted to a higher purpose, showing the beginnings of his loss of God's favor. This destructive cycle of lust, leading to betrayal and suffering, is a central theme in many dark Bible stories, and Samson's life, as detailed in the Book of Judges, is a prime example. Each time he yielded to these uncontrolled passions, he chipped away at his spiritual foundation and the sanctity of his sacred vows. It's as if his spiritual blindness grew with each compromise, He was engaged in a constant internal spiritual warfare, and too often, his fleshly desires won. This is a sobering thought, isn't it? That a man capable of such divine power could be so easily ensnared by temptation. The Philistines knew it, and Delilah certainly capitalized on this profound weakness. The consequences of sin here are not just about physical capture, but about the spiritual degradation, the slow erosion of his unique calling. It's a dark lesson in how human frailty, when unaddressed, becomes an open door for the enemy. We even see the Lord Jesus addressing the root of this in the New Testament, saying in Matthew 5:28, "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." This shows the depth of this struggle against lust, a battle that begins in the heart and mind, long before it manifests in destructive actions that lead to humiliation and destruction. The biblical narrative of Samson is a stark illustration of what happens when divine purpose is sacrificed on the altar of momentary pleasure. His uncontrolled passions were not just a minor flaw, they were the gateway to his downfall. This pattern of lust, seduction, and subsequent moral failure created a vulnerability that was repeatedly exploited, leading directly to his betrayal by Delilah. It's a grim picture of bondage to sin, where each indulgence tightened the chains, making him less able to fulfill his destiny and more susceptible to the manipulation of the Philistine. Imagine the internal conflict, the suffering that must have come from knowing deep down that he was straying from his path, yet feeling powerless against the pull of temptation. This is the tragic reality of unyielded weakness. His arrogance might have made him think he could handle it, that he could play with fire and not get burned, but the Old Testament is clear. The price of sin is always paid. This cautionary tale warns us that biblical warnings ignored regarding such passions invariably lead to devastating outcomes, often including the painful experience of when God departs, or at least his manifest power. So, as we consider Samson's struggles with lust and uncontrolled passions, it's crucial to see this not just as a historical account from the book of Judges, but as a timeless warning about a fundamental aspect of human frailty. The consequences of sin in this arena are profound, leading to spiritual blindness, the breaking of sacred vows, and an agonizing downfall. His story is one of the most poignant dark Bible stories precisely because it shows how a person with immense potential and God's strength can be brought low by an unmastered internal weakness. The temptation was persistent, the seduction by Delilah was cunning, but the door was opened by Samson's own repeated disobedience and failure to govern his desires. This path led him away from his divine purpose and set the stage for the ultimate violation of his commitments to God, a truly somber, dark lesson on the price of sin and the tragic journey towards temptation and ruin when passions dictate the course, pushing one ever closer to the breaking point of those sacred commitments. Now, my friend, we arrive at a truly solemn and pivotal point in Samson's tragic biblical narrative, a core theme in these dark Bible stories that echoes with profound warning through the ages, the breaking of sacred vows and the devastating spiritual consequences of sin that invariably follow such disobedience. We've talked about his arrogance, his lust, and the seduction by Delilah, but all these threads converge on this critical violation of his Nazirite vow. This wasn't just any promise. The Nazirite vow, as detailed in the Old Testament, you can find its tenets in Numbers chapter 6, was a special consecration to God, setting an individual apart for divine service. For Samson, it was intrinsically linked to his incredible God strength. His uncut hair was the outward symbol of this holy dedication and the divine power that flowed through him. It was a pact, a sacred agreement, and its integrity was paramount. Yet, as Delilah, driven by her greed and the instigation of the Philistines, relentlessly pressed him, we see a progressive, heart-wrenching dismantling of this vow. Each concession he made, each piece of the truth he surrendered about his consecrated life was another step away from God, another crack in the foundation of his unique calling, illustrating a profound moral failure and the terrifying price of sin. This gradual erosion is a key dark lesson from the book of Judges. The insidious nature of temptation, especially as wielded by Delilah, is that it often doesn't demand a full surrender at once, but rather a series of seemingly small compromises. Samson, caught in the web of seduction and his own weakness, began to unravel the secrets of his Nazirite vow. He told her about new ropes, then new bowstrings, inching closer to the ultimate truth with each lie that failed to bind him, a dangerous game of manipulation he thought he could control. This gradual disobedience is a critical aspect of Samson's fall from grace. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic break initially, but a slow leak of his spiritual fortitude, a bit-by-bit surrender of his sacred vows. This is a chilling reminder from these dark Bible stories of how human frailty can lead to a slippery slope of compromise. The consequences of sin were accumulating with each false assurance he gave Delilah, each act of toying with his consecration. He was, in essence, devaluing the very source of his God's strength, forgetting that his divine power was not his own, but a gift contingent upon his obedience to the terms of the Nazirite vow. This path of corruption was leading him straight towards temptation and ruin. When Samson finally divulged the ultimate secret of his Nazirite vow, that his strength lay in his uncut hair, the most visible sign of his lifelong dedication, it was the culmination of his disobedience, the final surrender to Delilah's persistent seduction, and his own moral failure. The biblical narrative in the book of Judges is stark. His hair was shorn, and with it, something far more profound was lost. You see, the hair itself wasn't magic. It was the symbol of his obedience and consecration to God. Its loss signified the breaking of that sacred pact, the final act in a series of betrayals of his sacred vows. And what followed? The Old Testament tells us he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Judges 16:20. This is the ultimate spiritual consequence of sin, the loss of God's favor, the withdrawal of his manifest presence and divine power. This moment is one of the most chilling in all of Samson's tragedy, a stark warning about when God departs. His physical strength vanished because the spiritual foundation for that God's strength had been utterly compromised by his repeated disobedience and the violation of his covenant. It's a devastating illustration of the price of sin. The gravity of violating spiritual commitments, these sacred vows we make before God, cannot be overstated, and Samson's story is a primary exhibit in these dark Bible stories. Whether it's a formal vow like the Nazirite vow or the implicit vows of a life dedicated to following Christ, such as seeking to live a holy life as Paul urges in Romans 12:1-2, presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice, these commitments are serious business. Samson's downfall underscores that these are not mere suggestions, but sacred trusts. His betrayal of this trust, spurred by temptation and lust, led to his capture by the Philistines, his humiliation, and immense suffering. The book of Judges doesn't hold back in showing the direct line from disobedience to destruction. This cautionary tale teaches us that our spiritual commitments are a source of protection and divine power. To neglect or violate them is to invite spiritual vulnerability and the full weight of God's retribution or corrective discipline. It's a hard, dark lesson on human frailty and the need for constant vigilance in spiritual warfare to uphold our end of the covenant, lest we suffer the loss of God's favor. Therefore, the breaking of Samson's Nazirite vow stands as a monument in this biblical narrative to the severe consequences of sin and disobedience. It's a powerful testament within these Old Testament accounts to how critically important our vows and consecration are to maintaining our spiritual strength and connection to God's strength. The loss of his hair was merely the outward sign of an inward spiritual decay, a moral failure that culminated in the loss of God's favor. This wasn't just a personal tragedy for Samson. It's a timeless warning for all believers about the sanctity of our commitments to God. The Philistines could only triumph when Samson himself had dismantled his spiritual defenses through repeated violations of his sacred vows, driven by weakness and seduction. This devastating outcome, this price of sin, leads us directly to the next horrifying stage of his downfall, his physical blinding, an act that itself speaks volumes about a deeper, pre-existing condition, his profound, spiritual blindness. My friend, as we continue to navigate the harrowing path of Samson's fall from grace within this deeply impactful biblical narrative, we come to a moment of almost unimaginable horror and profound symbolism: the physical blinding of Samson by the Philistine. This act, described with chilling brevity in the book of Judges, Judges 16:21, "Then the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes," is far more than just a gruesome detail in one of the Old Testament's most dark Bible stories. It's a devastating physical manifestation of a pre-existing condition, a condition that had plagued him for years: his profound spiritual blindness. Oh, the irony is heart-wrenching, isn't it? The man who possessed extraordinary God's strength and saw with his physical eyes could not perceive the spiritual dangers all around him, particularly the temptation and betrayal embodied by Delilah. This act of gouging out his eyes serves as a terrifying climax to his disobedience, a stark metaphor for how sin, particularly arrogance and unchecked lust, can render us utterly sightless to truth and warning. The consequences of sin are often tragically literal, and in Samson's case, his external darkness mirrored an internal one, a moral failure of perception that led directly to his downfall and humiliation. This spiritual blindness wasn't a sudden affliction for Samson. It was a gradual dimming of his spiritual senses, cultivated over time through repeated disobedience and a stubborn insistence on following his own desires rather than divine guidance. He saw the obvious signs of Delilah's manipulation. 3 times she had cried, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson," after attempting to neutralize his divine power based on false information he'd given her. Any discerning person would have seen the betrayal for what it was, a clear warning sign. Yet his spiritual blindness, fueled by lust and perhaps an overweening pride in his own ability to control the seduction, kept him tethered to her. It's a chilling, dark lesson from the book of Judges on how human frailty and unyielded weakness can make us oblivious to even the most blatant dangers. He was blind to the true nature of his relationship with Delilah, blind to the corruption it represented, and blind to the inevitable price of sin. The Old Testament doesn't mince words here. His choices, born of this inner sightlessness, led him down a path of temptation and ruin, making these dark Bible stories resonate with such cautionary power. This inability to see the peril is a hallmark of when God departs in his guiding influence. The physical act of the Philistines gouging out Samson's eyes was, in a terribly direct way, God's retribution, or at least a permitted consequence, for his persistent spiritual blindness. He had refused to see the truth, so his physical sight was taken. It's a brutal but powerful illustration of how the spiritual often manifests in the physical realm, especially in these stark biblical narratives. His arrogance had made him believe he could toy with sin, with Delilah, with the Philistines, without facing severe consequences. His lust had clouded his judgment, making him prioritize fleeting pleasure over his sacred calling and the Nazirite vow. This moral failure, this persistent disobedience, is the very definition of spiritual blindness, an inability to discern spiritual truth, to see the long-term impact of one's actions, to recognize the warning signs God graciously provides. We might even recall Jesus' words in Mark 8:18, "Having eyes do you not see, and having ears do you not hear?" It speaks to a willful ignorance, a stubborn refusal to acknowledge the spiritual realities at play, a condition that led directly to Samson's suffering and humiliation. This tragedy serves as a potent cautionary tale. Imagine the terror and despair of that moment for Samson, the loss of his God's strength, the betrayal by Delilah now fully realized, and then the searing pain as his sight was stolen by the triumphant Philistine. This culmination of his downfall was the direct result of his prior refusal to see. His spiritual blindness had rendered him incapable of perceiving the danger in Delilah's seduction, incapable of heeding the biblical warnings ignored, and incapable of breaking free from the cycle of lust and pride. The book of Judges uses this horrific event to shout a warning to all who would read it. Spiritual sight is infinitely more valuable than physical sight. What good is it to see the world around you if you cannot see the state of your own soul or the spiritual perils you face? This Old Testament story hammers home the dark lesson that human frailty, when combined with arrogance and disobedience, inevitably leads to such catastrophic moral failure and the painful consequences of sin. The price of sin was now being exacted in a way that was both literal and deeply symbolic, a terrifying picture of temptation and ruin. Thus, Samson's physical blinding is far more than an act of enemy cruelty. It's the final, terrible unveiling of his long-standing spiritual blindness. It's a critical juncture in these dark Bible stories, highlighting the ultimate consequences of sin when pride and lust are allowed to obscure spiritual truth. This tragedy, recorded in the book of Judges, serves as an eternal cautionary tale about the imperative need for spiritual discernment, for seeing the world and its temptations not just with our physical eyes, but with eyes enlightened by divine wisdom. His humiliation at the hands of the Philistines, now a blind slave, is a direct outcome of his moral failure to govern his passions and heed the warning signs. This profound state of suffering and darkness, both literal and spiritual, naturally leads us to consider what happens when one feels utterly abandoned, when the silence of God becomes deafening, a chilling exploration of the price of sin paid through persistent disobedience. My dear friend, we now tread upon perhaps the most chilling and spiritually desolate ground in Samson's entire biblical narrative, a moment that should send shivers down the spine of anyone who values their connection with the Almighty. It's encapsulated in that horrifyingly quiet statement from the book of Judges 16:20, after Delilah had his hair, the symbol of his Nazirite vow, cut, but he did not know that the Lord had gone from him. Pause and let that sink in. This isn't just a line in one of the Old Testament's many dark Bible stories. It's the terrifying culmination of Samson's fall from grace, the ultimate price of sin paid for persistent disobedience. Imagine the sheer terror of that delayed realization, going to shake himself as before, expecting that familiar surge of God's strength, that divine power that had always been there, only to find nothing, an empty vessel. This is the stark reality of when God departs, the loss of God's favor made terrifyingly real. It wasn't a sudden whim on God's part. It was the inevitable consequence of sin, the result of Samson's continuous trampling upon his sacred vows, his arrogance, and his moral failure to heed divine warning. This moment speaks volumes about the gravity of spiritual corruption. The terror of this moment for Samson is almost unimaginable. His pride had likely convinced him that his God's strength was an entitlement, an unbreakable fixture of his being, rather than a conditional gift linked to his Nazirite vow and obedience. His spiritual blindness, which we just discussed, clearly extended to his perception of his relationship with God. He was so accustomed to the divine power that he failed to notice its departure until he was utterly helpless before the Philistine. This delayed awareness is a profound dark lesson from the book of Judges. Spiritual erosion can be so gradual, so subtle, that we might not recognize the extent of our loss of God's favor until we are in a moment of profound crisis. It's a chilling illustration of human frailty and the deceptive nature of habitual sin. His persistent disobedience, his dalliance with temptation through Delilah, his repeated breaking of sacred vows, all these accumulated, leading to this point of divine abandonment. The biblical narrative is unsparing in showing that this wasn't just about physical weakness. It was about a severed connection, the price of sin being a terrifying spiritual silence, a divine judgment. This concept of God withdrawing his manifest presence due to persistent disobedience is a sobering theme throughout the Old Testament. It's not that God ceases to exist or that his omnipresence is diminished, but rather his active, empowering, and protective presence can be withdrawn from those who stubbornly reject him and his ways. We see this in passages like Isaiah 59:2. But your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he will not hear. This was Samson's tragic reality. His life had become a testament to biblical warnings ignored. His moral failure wasn't a single act, but but a pattern of corruption that grieved the Spirit of God. The consequences of sin, when that sin is cherished and unrepented, can indeed lead to a state where one feels utterly alone, stripped of divine power, and left to face the humiliation and suffering of their choices. This is a crucial aspect of these dark Bible stories. They highlight not just human weakness, but also divine holiness and the necessity of walking in alignment with God to experience His full blessing and strength. Samson's story is a stark warning about the temptation and ruin that follows such prolonged spiritual neglect. The silence of God, the sense of abandonment Samson must have felt upon realizing his God's strength was gone, is a profound form of suffering. It's a spiritual desolation that far outweighs even physical torment. His arrogance was shattered, his pride crushed, leaving him in a state of utter weakness before his enemies, the Philistines. This wasn't just a tragedy of a strong man losing his power. It was the tragedy of a consecrated man losing his connection to the source of that power through his own disobedience and violation of his Nazirite vow. The book of Judges portrays this as a direct outcome of his choices, a clear divine judgment. This chilling episode serves as a cautionary tale for all time. Do not presume upon God's grace. Do not believe you can continually indulge in sin, ignore His warning signs, and still expect His divine power to operate through you unchecked. The price of sin is real, and one of its heaviest tolls is the potential for experiencing that dreadful silence, that sense of when God departs, a core theme in understanding the loss of God's favor which leads to so much destruction. So, as we reflect on this horrifying moment in Samson's life, he did not know that the Lord had gone from him. We are confronted with the ultimate spiritual consequence of sin, divine abandonment as a result of persistent disobedience. This dark lesson from the Old Testament underscores the critical importance of cherishing and nurturing our relationship with God, of heeding His guidance, and of honoring our sacred vows. Samson's journey through moral failure, spiritual blindness, and now this profound sense of loss of God's favor paints a grim picture of temptation and ruin. Yet, even in this pit of despair, this state of utter humiliation and suffering at the hands of the Philistines, the biblical narrative is not quite finished with him. His story takes one final desperate turn, forcing us to consider if there can be any form of repentance or divine purpose fulfilled even in the midst of utter destruction and revenge. My friend, as we reach the final, earth-shattering moments of Samson's life in the book of Judges, we're confronted with an act so monumental and morally complex that it continues to fuel debate and reflection, a fittingly tumultuous end to one of the Old Testament's most dark Bible stories. We're talking about his last stand, blind, humiliated, and paraded as a sport for the Philistines in the temple of their god, Dagon. In this state of utter weakness and suffering, Samson utters a desperate prayer. "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Judges 16:28. With a final surge of God's strength, he brings the temple crashing down, resulting in immense destruction, killing more in his death than he did in his life. But here's the profound question that hangs heavy in the air. Was this an act of genuine repentance and restored faith? A final blaze of divine power used for a righteous, albeit devastating purpose? Or was it primarily a cry of personal revenge, the last bitter outburst of a man consumed by his humiliation and seeking to exact the ultimate price for his suffering, a final act in his personal tragedy that underscores the severe consequences of sin? This ambiguity is what makes his end such a potent, dark lesson. The argument for some measure of repentance or a return to faith in Samson's final act often points to his direct appeal to God, acknowledging the sovereign Lord as the source of his hoped-for strength. The author of Hebrews even includes Samson in the Hall of Faith, Hebrews 11:32, listing him among those who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. This New Testament reference certainly suggests that in the grand sweep of God's sovereignty, his final act was perceived as one of faith, perhaps a desperate last-minute reclaiming of his calling to deliver Israel from the Philistines, a final use of divine power. However, the raw desire for revenge, for my two eyes, is undeniably present in his prayer, adding a layer of complexity to this biblical narrative. It complicates any simplistic notion of a purely heroic or redeemed end. This isn't a clean victory. It's messy, steeped in personal anguish, and a desire for God's retribution to be channeled through him in a very personal way. It speaks to the ongoing moral failure and human frailty that characterized his life, even as it points to a flicker of reliance on God's strength at the very end. This truly is one of the most challenging dark Bible stories to fully reconcile. On the other hand, the somber implications of this final act of destruction cannot be ignored. Even if it served God's broader purpose of striking a blow against the oppressive Philistines, the scene is one of carnage. Samson, in his final moments, doesn't offer a prayer for forgiveness for his own sin or his disobedience that led to his downfall. His focus is on a final, cataclysmic act of revenge. This highlights the tragedy of his life. Even in death, his actions are intertwined with violence and personal vendetta. The Old Testament doesn't shy away from portraying its figures with all their flaws, and Samson is a prime example. His end, while demonstrating a return of God's strength, doesn't erase the years of moral failure, the spiritual blindness, or the pride that led him to this desperate point. It's a stark warning that even when God uses individuals for his purposes, their human motivations can remain deeply complex and flawed. The consequences of sin had brought him to this place of suffering, and his response, while powerful, is still tinged with the darkness that had often clouded his judgment. A final act in a life that stands as a cautionary tale regarding the price of sin. This isn't a simple tale of temptation and ruin followed by clear redemption. This moral ambiguity in Samson's end is a testament to the raw honesty of the biblical narrative. The book of Judges presents life in all its gritty reality, where motives are mixed, and even acts that achieve a divine purpose can be fraught with human imperfection. God's sovereignty is such that he can weave even the tangled threads of Samson's life, his moral failures, his desire for revenge, and his final desperate plea for divine power into his larger plan for Israel and his judgment against the Philistine. This final act did indeed result in a significant blow to the Philistine leadership, fulfilling part of his destiny. Yet the immense destruction and loss of life, including his own, underscore the tragedy inherent in his story. It's a dark lesson that victory can sometimes look like devastation, and deliverance can come at an almost unbearable price. This ending doesn't offer easy answers, but forces us to grapple with the complexities of faith, human frailty, divine judgment, and the often inscrutable ways of God, especially when dealing with figures from dark Bible stories whose lives are a constant warning. Ultimately, Samson's final destructive act serves as a somber capstone to a life defined by immense potential and equally immense moral failure. Whether viewed primarily as an act of repentance, faith-fueled revenge, or desperate self-immolation that also served God's sovereignty, it leaves us with a profound sense of tragedy and a multitude of dark lessons. The Old Testament, through the book of Judges, gives us in Samson a figure who embodies the struggle between God's strength and profound human weakness, between divine calling and personal downfall. His story is a stark warning about the consequences of sin, the price of sin, the dangers of arrogance, lust, and disobedience, and the devastating impact of spiritual blindness. Even in his final moment of recalled divine power and triumph over the Philistines, the echoes of his lifelong suffering and the immense destruction he wrought remind us that his path was one largely defined by temptation and ruin, making his inclusion in Hebrews 11 a point of deep theological reflection on faith, found even in the deepest darkness. So, there you have it, the harrowing descent of a spiritual giant, a man blessed with God's strength, yet crippled by his own human frailty. As we've journeyed through Samson's life, from his dangerous arrogance to his final devastating act of revenge, what's the one dark lesson from his tragedy that hits closest to home for you? Are there any modern-day Delilahs or personal Philistines you realize you need to guard against more vigilantly after hearing this? Share your reflections and experiences in the comments below. Let's learn from each other and build a community that's wise to the enemy's schemes and the subtle temptation that can lead to moral failure. Your insight could be the warning someone else needs to avoid the devastating consequences of sin. If these deep dives into the dark Bible stories and the raw truths of the Old Testament resonate with you, and you don't want to miss out on more transformative content that reveals the hidden spiritual battles and the price of sin, please make sure you subscribe to Bible Stories right now and hit that notification bell. It's the surest way to stay connected and continue arming yourself with spiritual wisdom. And don't stop here. The spiritual journey continues. Click on the video appearing on your screen now for another crucial message that will further equip you in your walk of faith. Thank you for joining us. This is Bible Stories, reminding you to stay vigilant, stay rooted in truth, and never underestimate the spiritual warfare at hand.